Hi everyone, my name is Rory O'Sullivan and I'm a staff officer working in EMRA on the EU Just Transition Fund. Today I'm going to discuss a topic known as N+3 and we will take a look at the budget for the fund. Today's session is for information on N+3 and should highlight how this is of particular importance to the fund. I know that when we speak about the JTF, the pressures of the timeline are often brought up. So to reassure you, we are listening to these concerns, but please note the timeline and requirement for N+3 is prescribed in the CPR. So, firstly, I'm going to set the scene on how we're going to approach this topic. I'm going to cover what N+3 is and why it's important. But before we get into that, we'll need some additional context. In order to understand how N+3 affects EU funding, I'm going to give a quick run through of the structure of cohesion funds using the EU JTF as an example. When we look at the EU Just Transition Fund, it's easy to think of it as one single unit encompassing the whole fund. However, it's actually made up of two funding sources. The EU JTF is co-funded between the European Union and the Irish government. The Exchequer funding comes with its own considerations. Circulars such as the Management and Control Circular put specific stipulations on it, and annual carryover is a significant factor. However, in the context of today's presentation, we will focus on EU funding. When we look at the EU funding, the JTF is split again between the Next Generation EU funding and the Multi-Annual Financial Framework. But that's not all. It further divides into allocations which are given each year. And the fund being split into these 6 allocations is where this gets significant. So, why does this matter? This is quite important as each of these allotments has a 4-year shelf life, quite similar to an expiration date for food. The 4-year shelf life is made up of the year, which we refer to as N, plus an additional 3 years, otherwise known as N+3. So what does this look like in practice? I'm going to quickly run through 2 examples. For each, the fund will be a €50 million fund with 5 annual allocations of €10 million. Example 1 will be a demonstration of how spend is drawn down according to plan. And example 2 will look at what happens when loss due to N+3 occurs. In year 1, €10 million is allocated to a fund. The program is still being designed, so it doesn't have a spend, and the full €10 million remains available to claim. In year 2, another €10 million is allocated, and €4 million is spent. At the end of year 2, there is €16 million available, 6 from year 1 and 10 from year 2. In year 3, they get another 10, and they spend 8. So year 1's allocation is now claimed, and they're dipping into the allocation for year 2. In year 4, they get 10 and spend 10. In 5, they get the final 10, and they spend 12. And in year 6, they spend 14. By the end of year 6, the total allotment of the €50 million is spent on time. But what if things don't run so smoothly? With the same allocations, but a slower spending profile, let's see how things go. In year 1, 10 million is added to the fund. As before, the program is still being designed, so it doesn't have a spend, and the full 10 million remains available to claim. In year 2, another 10 is allocated, but this time only €1 million is spent. At the end of year 2, there is €19 million available, 9 from year 1 and 10 from year 2. In year 3, they get another 10 and spend 2. At the end of year 3, there is still €7 million in year 1's allocation. In year 4, another 10 million is allocated, and €4 million is spent. €3 million remains as we move into year 5. Here, another 10 is added. However, we are now 5 years out from the year 1 allocation, and it was partly unclaimed, meaning an allocation of €3 million has been lost to the fund. This would either need to be provided from another funding source, or the projects would have to accept a funding shortfall. So to recap on what we've gone over so far, we've looked at how the EU JTF is structured between the Exchequer, the Next Generation EU, and the Multiannual Financial Framework. How that is further divided into yearly allotments, each of which has a 4-year shelf life, which is the N+3 principle. And finally, we have looked at some worked examples of how a fund runs in an ideal scenario, and how funding allocation can be lost if things move too slowly. So now, let's see why this is of particular relevance to the EU Just Transition Fund. In the worked examples, the funding was split into evenly sized allocations, provided annually throughout the life of the fund. Even with that, we've seen how a delay in the early days of a fund can amount to losses of allocation. However, the EU Just Transition Fund has this structure. It is heavily front-loaded in its funding, as more than half of the fund comes from the 2022 and 2023 allocations. This is because the Next Gen EU Fund only covers 21 to 23, and the 2021 allocation was split over 2022 and 2023. Because of this, the first two instances of N+3 affecting the JTF, 25 and 26, pose important deadlines for the fund. Anything unclaimed from the first €60 million from all of the funding sources at the end of 2025 is no longer available to the fund. By the end of 2026, the fund will need to have spent and claimed €120 million of the total €168 million. It's important to note that this affects EU funding and the Exchequer. So, by the end of 2025, we need to have 35% of the fund spent and claimed. A total spend of €60 million. By the end of 2026, that figure rises to 70%, a total spend of €120 million. And for context, so far across all the member states with JTF programs, only 2% of funding has been drawn down. In other words, in the hypothetical scenario where we are unsuccessful in claiming all or even a substantial part of the 2022 and 2023 allotments, we would have a program designed, geared up and working to spend €168 million, but as little as €48 million to cover it. That's a shortfall of €120 million. With this in mind, I'm now going to go through a high-level overview of the current budget for the EU JTF. Initially, I will go through the spend year by year, and then we will pull back and look at an overview of the budget in table form. 2023's budget runs from the 1st of July 2023 to the 30th of June 2024. However, it is important to note that an allowance of 6 months should be factored in to allow for the verification and claims process. For 2023, Priority 1 has a budget of €14.5 million. Priority 2 has a little over €3 million, and Priority 3 plans to spend €225,000. In 2024, Priority 1 has a budget of €28 million, Priority 2 will spend €10 million, and Priority 3 budgets €4.5 million. In 2025, Priority 1 is at €25 million, Priority 2 will spend €21 million, and Priority 3 will spend €7 million. And lastly, in 2026, Priority 1 will spend €19 million, Priority 2, €22 million, and Priority 3 will spend €6 million. And to pull back, here are those same figures, but in table form. This gives us a budget overview which, if successful, puts us ahead of the N+3 deadlines. However, it is important that the 2024 spending is achieved, and there is sight of the 2025 budget. So to conclude, this is a very challenging deadline, and while the EU Just Transition Fund has been designed in such a way as to front-load the spending, a sustained effort will be required to stay on top of things. N+3 presents a real challenge to the fund, but by working hard to make full use of Ireland's allocation, we will deliver impactful projects in the Just Transition territory to ensure no one is left behind.